August 15th, 1951. The Ku Klux Klan's presence in New York City was smaller and less visible than in southern states, but no less dangerous to black Americans who threatened white supremacist beliefs about racial hierarchy and proper social order. Bumpy Johnson, at 51 years old and controlling Harlem's most profitable criminal operations, represented everything the Klan opposed. A black man with power, wealth, influence, and the audacity to operate without deference to white authority. The specific KKK clavern that targeted Bumpy operated out of Staten Island, led by a man named Robert Grand Dragon Bob McCarthy, a 47-year-old construction company owner who'd been active in the Klan since 1935 and who viewed the organization's mission as protecting white America from what he termed Negro criminality and uppity behavior. McCarthy had been watching Bumpy's operations for months, had documented his movements, had identified patterns and vulnerabilities that might allow for an action that would simultaneously eliminate a prominent black criminal and send a message to Harlem's community about the limits of acceptable Negro ambition. The plan that McCarthy developed with 5 other Klan members was designed to be symbolic rather than simply lethal. They could have shot Bumpy, could have bombed his home, could have used any number of methods that would have killed him quickly and efficiently. But McCarthy wanted something more theatrical, something that would invoke Christian imagery while perverting it into a demonstration of white supremacist power. He wanted crucifixion, the same method that Romans had used to execute criminals and rebels, the same torture that Christian theology centered on, now deployed against a black man who McCarthy believed embodied criminal rebellion against proper racial order. The capture happened on August 15th at 2:47 a.m., when Bumpy was leaving a meeting at a warehouse on the Brooklyn waterfront. The meeting had involved negotiations with Italian mob representatives about territorial boundaries and profit-sharing arrangements, the kind of high-level business that required Bumpy's personal attendance and that kept him out later than his usual routine allowed. The warehouse district was industrial, isolated at night, the kind of location where violence could occur without immediate witnesses or intervention. 6 men emerged from positions they'd maintained for 3 hours, waiting for the meeting to conclude and for Bumpy to emerge alone. The ambush was coordinated and overwhelming. 2 men from the front, 2 from behind, 2 from the sides, all moving simultaneously with weapons drawn and with clear intention to capture rather than kill. Bumpy managed to draw his own weapon, managed to fire twice before being overwhelmed by numbers and positioning that made effective resistance impossible. 1 shot went wide. The second hit Tommy Cross Williams, in the shoulder, a wound that was painful but not immediately incapacitating. Bumpy was restrained at 2:51 a.m., his hands secured behind his back with rope, a hood pulled over his head to prevent him from identifying the location where he was being transported. The 6 Klan members, Robert McCarthy, Thomas Williams, James Jimmy Nails Peterson, Harold Harry the Hammer Schmidt, William Billy Rope Johnson, and David Davy Scripture Mills, loaded Bumpy into a panel van and drove him to a warehouse in Staten Island that McCarthy's construction company owned, and that had been prepared specifically for what was coming. The warehouse was abandoned, scheduled for demolition in 3 months, which meant that damage to its interior wouldn't attract attention or investigation. More importantly, it provided the kind of isolated space where activities could occur without interruption from neighbors, police, or anyone else who might interfere with what the 6 Klan members had planned. The warehouse had been prepared with specific equipment: industrial hammers, 6-inch iron nails typically used in construction, ropes for securing and positioning, and a wooden beam that had been mounted horizontally against the warehouse's eastern wall at a height of approximately 7 feet. The hood was removed from Bumpy's head at 3:34 a.m., allowing him to see the warehouse interior and the 6 white men in Klan robes who stood around him. Robert McCarthy spoke first, his voice carrying the kind of theatrical certainty that came from believing absolutely in the righteousness of his cause. "Bumpy Johnson, you've been living above your station, operating in our city like you have the same rights as white men. Making money, wielding power, acting like the color of your skin doesn't matter. Tonight you learn that it does matter. Tonight you learn what happens to uppity Negroes who forget their place." Bumpy's response was silence. He understood immediately that speaking would accomplish nothing, that these men had already decided what would happen, that the only variables were how long it would take and whether he would survive. The calculation he was making during those first minutes wasn't about negotiation or appeal. It was about observation, about memorizing faces despite the hoods, about noting details that would be useful if he survived, about maintaining mental control while his body was about to experience trauma designed to break both flesh and spirit. The crucifixion preparation began at 3:41 a.m. Bumpy was stripped to the waist, his shirt and jacket removed to expose his torso and arms. He was positioned against the wooden beam that had been mounted to the wall, his arms extended horizontally along the beam's length, his body weight supported partially by ropes that Harry Schmidt tied around his chest to prevent him from collapsing completely when the nails were driven through his hands. The ropes weren't mercy. They were practical necessity to ensure he remained conscious and aware during the crucifixion, rather than going into immediate shock from trauma and pain. James Peterson held Bumpy's right hand flat against the wooden beam at 3:47 a.m., spreading the fingers to expose the palm and positioning it so that the nail would be driven through the center of the hand, rather than through the wrist where bones might have prevented full penetration. Robert McCarthy lifted the industrial hammer, a 10-pound tool designed for driving large nails through construction materials, and positioned a 6-inch iron nail against Bumpy's palm, with the kind of careful aim that demonstrated he'd thought about this moment extensively. The first hammer blow struck at 3:48 a.m., driving the nail through skin, muscle, and the small bones of Bumpy's hand, penetrating completely through to embed in the wooden beam behind. The pain was immediate and absolute, the kind of agony that overwhelms nervous system capacity to process sensation as anything other than pure signal of catastrophic damage. Bumpy made no sound. He didn't scream, didn't cry out, didn't give McCarthy the satisfaction of knowing that the pain was as devastating as it actually was. This silence was act of will rather than absence of suffering, was conscious decision to deny his torturers the response they expected. The second nail was driven through Bumpy's left hand at 3:52 a.m., positioned identically to the first, penetrating through palm and into the wooden beam with 3 hammer blows that secured his hand completely. 2 nails, 2 hands. Bumpy now hung from the warehouse wall, his arms extended horizontally along the mounted beam, his weight partially supported by the ropes around his chest and partially by the iron nails driven through both palms. The position was sustainable for minutes rather than hours. Crucifixion kills through gradual asphyxiation as body weight makes breathing progressively more difficult, but death typically takes hours or even days, rather than the quick termination that other execution methods provide. Robert McCarthy stepped back to observe his work, to confirm that the crucifixion had been executed as planned, that Bumpy Johnson was secured to the wall in position that invoked Christian imagery while perverting it into demonstration of white supremacist power. "You're going to hang there until you die," McCarthy said, his voice carrying satisfaction that came from believing he'd successfully punished someone who'd violated racial boundaries. "Could be hours, could be a full day, but you'll die eventually, and when you do, we'll leave your body here as message to every other Negro in New York who thinks he can operate like he's equal to white men." The 6 Klan members left the warehouse at 4:07 a.m., confident that Bumpy was secured adequately, that escape was impossible for a man crucified to a wall, that death would come through gradual process that required no additional intervention from them. They would return in the morning to confirm that Bumpy was dead, to photograph the body for propaganda purposes, to dispose of remains in a way that would prevent discovery while ensuring that rumors spread through Harlem about what had happened. But they made 3 critical errors in their planning, 3 miscalculations that would transform this attempted execution into the worst mistake of their lives. First, they underestimated Bumpy's pain tolerance. Years of street violence had taught him to function through injuries that would incapacitate most people. Second, they overestimated the security of 6-inch nails driven through hands rather than wrists. The nails held initially but hadn't been driven at angles that would prevent extraction if sufficient force was applied. Third, they assumed that a man crucified to a wall would remain passive, waiting for death, rather than attempting the kind of desperate physical action that pain and position should have made impossible. Bumpy remained hanging from the wall for approximately 17 minutes after the Klan members departed, using that time not to despair or panic, but to assess his situation with the clinical detachment that had kept him alive through 3 decades of criminal operations. The nails through his hands were agonizing but hadn't severed major blood vessels or tendons completely. His fingers still responded to conscious movement, which meant that hand function wasn't entirely compromised. The ropes around his chest were supporting most of his weight. which meant that the immediate pressure on his hands was bearable rather than overwhelming. The wooden beam was solid but not immovable. It had been mounted to the warehouse wall with bolts that allowed some flex and movement. At 4:24 a.m., Bumpy began the process that 6 Klan members would have considered impossible. He started pulling his right hand free from the nail that secured it to the wooden beam. The mechanics required were straightforward in concept but agonizing in execution. The nail had been driven through the center of his palm, penetrating completely through hand tissue and embedding approximately 2 inches into the wooden beam. Extracting the nail required pulling his entire hand backward, while the nail remained fixed in position, which meant forcing his hand tissue backward over 6 inches of iron shaft, tearing through the same flesh and muscle that the nail had penetrated when it was driven through. The extraction took 11 minutes of sustained effort that required Bumpy to overcome every instinct that screamed for him to stop, to accept the pain of remaining crucified, rather than enduring the greater agony of tearing his hand free. He pulled steadily, using his body weight and the limited leverage that his position allowed, feeling tissue tear and bones separate as his hand moved backward along the nail's shaft. Blood ran down his arm in quantities that would have been alarming if he'd had capacity to pay attention to anything other than the immediate task of extraction. At 4:35 a.m., Bumpy's right hand pulled free from the nail that had secured it to the wooden beam. The damage was catastrophic. A 6-inch hole through the center of his palm, torn tissue that would require surgical repair if infection was to be prevented, bones that had been fractured by the nail's penetration and worsened by the extraction. But his right hand was free, which meant he had leverage to begin extracting his left hand from its nail. The second extraction was faster because Bumpy now had a free hand to use, could grip the wooden beam and pull, rather than relying solely on body weight and positioning. His left hand came free at 4:41 a.m., suffering damage identical to the right hand but achieving the freedom that would allow him to climb down from the wall where he'd been crucified. Bumpy dropped to the warehouse floor at 4:43 a.m., his hands bleeding profusely, his arms barely functional from the trauma they'd sustained, but alive and conscious and absolutely committed to ensuring that 6 men understood they'd made fatal error in judgment. Bumpy Johnson walked out of the Staten Island warehouse at 5:03 a.m. on August 15, 1951. 20 minutes after pulling the last nail from his left hand, his arms barely functional, and his hands destroyed by trauma that would require months of medical treatment and would leave permanent damage even with the best care available. But he was conscious, mobile, and absolutely focused on a single objective: ensuring that 6 men who'd crucified him would experience identical fate, crucified on the same wall, with the same nails, suffering the same agony they'd inflicted. The immediate challenge was medical treatment that would stabilize his condition without involving hospitals or police, who would ask questions that Bumpy couldn't answer, without triggering investigations he didn't want. He made a phone call from a payphone 3 blocks from the warehouse at 5:17 a.m., reaching Marcus Webb with a message that was brief and contained all necessary information. 6 KKK crucified me. Staten Island warehouse. I'm out. Need medical team and crew. 12 men minimum. Find the 6. Bring them alive. Marcus had worked with Bumpy long enough that the message required no clarification or follow-up questions. Within 30 minutes, a medical team arrived at the location Bumpy had specified. A safe house in Brooklyn that was maintained specifically for treating injuries that couldn't be explained to legitimate medical authorities. The doctor who examined Bumpy's hands at 6:04 a.m. delivered an assessment that was clinical and devastating. Both hands had sustained damage that included torn tissue through the palms, fractured metacarpal bones, severed tendons that would require surgical repair, and wounds that were already showing early signs of infection from the rust and contamination on the nails that had been used. The immediate treatment involved cleaning the wounds, administering antibiotics to prevent infection from progressing, and immobilizing both hands in splints that would prevent further damage while bones and tissue began healing. The doctor's prognosis was that Bumpy would regain perhaps 70% of normal hand function if treatment was aggressive and infection was controlled. But that permanent limitations were inevitable: reduced grip strength, chronic pain, decreased fine motor control. These were injuries that would affect everything Bumpy did for the rest of his life. But treatment of existing injuries was secondary to preparation for what was coming. While the doctor worked on Bumpy's hands, Marcus had already begun assembling the crew that would be necessary for hunting 6 Klan members who would certainly be alert to possibility of retaliation. Marcus gathered 15 men by 7:30 a.m., each of them veterans of street conflicts who understood that the operation they were about to execute required precision rather than overwhelming force, required capture rather than killing, required keeping targets alive and functional for what Bumpy had planned. The intelligence gathering that followed over the next 9 hours demonstrated the value of networks that Bumpy had cultivated over decades of operation. The 6 Klan members had returned to their normal lives after leaving Bumpy crucified in the warehouse, believing that death would come slowly and that their involvement would remain undetected. Robert McCarthy had gone home to Staten Island, had breakfast with his wife, had gone to his construction company office to begin his workday, as if nothing unusual had occurred the previous night. The other 5 had similarly resumed their routines, confident that the crucifixion had been successful and that investigation would be minimal even if Bumpy's body was eventually discovered. But Bumpy's organization had capabilities that the Klan members had fundamentally underestimated. Within 3 hours of Bumpy making his initial phone call to Marcus, all 6 Klan members had been identified, their home addresses documented, their daily routines mapped, their vulnerabilities assessed. By noon on August 15th, the hunting teams had been deployed with explicit instructions. Capture all 6 men alive, transport them to the same Staten Island warehouse where they'd crucified Bumpy, secure them in a way that would prevent escape or suicide, and wait for Bumpy to arrive for what would be the final phase of the operation. The first capture happened at 1:47 p.m. when Thomas Williams was grabbed from his car in a Staten Island parking lot. Williams had stopped at a grocery store on his way home from work, had parked in a relatively isolated section of the lot, had provided exactly the kind of opportunity that professional abduction teams could exploit. 4 men approached from different directions, had Williams restrained and gagged before he could scream or fight, had him loaded into a van and transported to the warehouse within 90 seconds of initial contact. David Mills was second, taken from his home at 3:23 p.m. while his wife was out shopping. The capture was executed through a ruse. 2 men posing as utility workers knocked on Mills's door, claiming they needed to check gas lines in the basement, gained entry, and had Mills restrained before he understood what was actually happening. He was transported to the warehouse, secured alongside Williams in a section of the building that had been prepared specifically for holding multiple prisoners. Harold Schmidt was third, captured at 4:56 p.m. when he left his workplace, a hardware store where he worked as manager. Schmidt had been cautious, had varied his route home, had demonstrated awareness that retaliation might be coming. But caution wasn't sufficient protection against a team that had been tracking his movements for hours, and that could deploy enough personnel to cover multiple possible routes. Schmidt was intercepted 3 blocks from the hardware store, restrained in his own vehicle, driven to the warehouse by men who'd simply waited in his car while he completed his shift. William Johnson was fourth, taken at 6:34 p.m. from a bar where he'd stopped after work. The capture was executed inside the bar itself, with sufficient speed and efficiency that other patrons didn't realize what had happened until Johnson had been removed through the back exit. The bartender who witnessed the abduction was presented with a choice that wasn't really a choice. Accept $500 to forget what he'd seen, or deal with consequences that would be significantly more expensive. He took the money and claimed later that he'd been in the storage room when the incident occurred. James Peterson was fifth, captured at 7:47 p.m. when he arrived home to his apartment in Brooklyn. Peterson had been the most cautious of the 6, had taken different routes, had checked his surroundings, had demonstrated the kind of awareness that suggested he understood that Bumpy Johnson might have survived and that retaliation was possible. But awareness without adequate security was insufficient. Peterson was grabbed in his apartment building's hallway by 6 men who'd been waiting in the stairwell, was restrained and transported before any neighbor could intervene or call police. Robert McCarthy was last, and his capture required the most elaborate planning because he was the Grand Dragon, the leader who'd ordered Bumpy's crucifixion, and who had the most resources for protection. McCarthy had gone home to Staten Island after work, had activated a security system, had weapons accessible, had prepared for the possibility that his role in Bumpy's crucifixion might be discovered. But McCarthy's preparations assumed direct assault rather than the approach that Bumpy's team actually deployed. At 9:23 p.m., a fire was started in a dumpster behind McCarthy's home. Not a large fire, not dangerous enough to threaten the house, but sufficient to trigger response from neighbors and eventually from fire department. McCarthy emerged from his home at 9:34 p.m. to observe the commotion, to ensure that his property wasn't threatened, to play the role of concerned homeowner. He was grabbed at 9:37 p.m. by 8 men who'd been positioned around his property, who'd waited for him to exit his secured home, who had him restrained and loaded into a vehicle before the fire trucks arrived. By 10:15 p.m. on August 15, 1951, less than 20 hours after Bumpy had been crucified, all 6 Klan members who'd participated in that crucifixion were secured in the same Staten Island warehouse where they'd tortured him, positioned in the same section of the building, able to see the wooden beam still mounted to the eastern wall and still showing bloodstains from where Bumpy's hands had been nailed through. Bumpy Johnson arrived at the warehouse at 10:47 p.m., his hands still bandaged and splinted from the medical treatment he'd received that morning, his arms barely functional from the trauma sustained during his own crucifixion. But he was conscious, mobile, and prepared to execute the retribution that he'd planned during the 19 hours since pulling himself free from the wall. Marcus Webb and 12 other men were present as witnesses and assistants for what was coming, their role being to handle the physical labor that Bumpy couldn't perform with destroyed hands, while Bumpy directed the overall operation. The crucifixions began at 11:03 p.m. with Thomas Williams, the man who'd been shot by Bumpy during the initial capture attempt, and who'd participated in driving the first nail through Bumpy's right hand. Williams was stripped to the waist, positioned against the wooden beam mounted to the warehouse wall, his arms extended horizontally along the beam's length in exact replication of how Bumpy had been positioned. Marcus Webb held Williams's right hand flat against the beam while Bumpy, despite his bandaged and splinted hands, lifted one of the same 6-inch nails that had been used on him and positioned it against Williams's palm. "You drove a nail through my hand," Bumpy said, his voice carrying no particular emotion, stating fact rather than making accusation. "Now you understand what that feels like. Same nail, same wall, same position. You wanted to crucify an uppity Negro. Now you experience crucifixion yourself." Marcus drove the nail through Williams's right hand with the same industrial hammer that the Klan members had used, penetrating through palm and into the wooden beam with 3 solid blows. Williams screamed, the sound echoing through the warehouse with intensity that demonstrated he lacked Bumpy's capacity for silent endurance of agony. The second nail was driven through Williams's left hand, securing him to the wall in position that was identical to how Bumpy had been crucified 11 hours earlier. David Mills was second, crucified at 11:34 p.m. alongside Williams, positioned on the same beam with enough separation that both men could be secured without their bodies touching. Mills received the same treatment, 2 nails through 2 hands, driven into the same wooden beam, creating the same catastrophic injuries that Bumpy had sustained. Mills also screamed, also demonstrated that the pain was beyond his capacity to endure silently, also learned exactly what they'd inflicted on Bumpy. Harold Schmidt was third, crucified at 12:07 a.m. on August 16th. William Johnson was fourth, secured to the wall at 12:41 a.m. James Peterson was fifth, crucified at 1:16 a.m. Each man received identical treatment. 2 6-inch nails driven through both hands, secured to the wooden beam, positioned to create the same suffering they'd inflicted. Each man screamed, begged, pleaded for mercy that Bumpy had no intention of providing. The warehouse filled with the sounds of agony that 6 Klan members had expected Bumpy to make, but had been denied when his silence had robbed them of that satisfaction. Robert McCarthy was last, crucified at 1:53 a.m. as the Grand Dragon, who'd ordered and planned the entire operation. Before the nails were driven through McCarthy's hands, Bumpy spoke directly to him, ensuring that the Klan leader understood exactly what was happening and why. "You wanted to send a message to Harlem about what happens to uppity Negroes. I'm sending a different message back. Every man here is going to die on this wall. Your bodies will be discovered. And everyone who hears this story will understand that crucifying Bumpy Johnson was the worst decision you ever made." McCarthy was secured to the wall at 2:04 a.m., the 6th and final Klan member crucified on the same wooden beam where Bumpy had been tortured. The 6 men hung from the warehouse wall, their arms extended horizontally, their hands penetrated by the same nails that had been used on Bumpy, experiencing the same agony that would continue for hours as their body weight made breathing progressively more difficult, and as blood loss and shock gradually overwhelmed their systems. Bumpy and his crew left the warehouse at 2:23 a.m., abandoning the 6 crucified men to the same fate they'd intended for him. The difference was that Bumpy had survived through extraordinary will and pain tolerance that allowed him to pull himself free. The 6 Klan members lacked that capacity. They would remain crucified until death came through gradual asphyxiation and blood loss, a process that medical examiners would later estimate took between 8 and 14 hours, depending on individual physiology and the specific positioning of each body. The bodies were discovered at 11:47 a.m. on August 16 when a worker arrived at the warehouse for unrelated business and found 6 white men crucified on a wooden beam, all dead from injuries consistent with prolonged suspension and blood loss from nails driven through their hands. The investigation that followed was extensive, involved FBI attention because Klan involvement was immediately obvious from the robes that had been left at the scene, and ultimately resulted in 0 arrests despite everyone in New York's criminal underworld understanding exactly who was responsible. The message was received by every white supremacist organization operating in New York. Bumpy Johnson had been crucified by 6 Klan members and had pulled himself free through impossible determination. Those 6 Klan members had then been crucified on the same wall with the same nails, and all 6 had died there. The mathematics were perfect. The symbolism was clear. The retaliation was absolute, and the understanding was universal. Attempting to crucify Bumpy Johnson was suicide that would be returned with interest that compounded into death on the same wall where the original crime had been committed.